All right, folks. Good to see everyone this afternoon. Pray God's blessings on you. Braving the weather and the virus and all the other things that are become a part of our daily routine. Glad you are here today. We are in Mark chapter 15. Mark chapter 15. Now, I wonder if there are folks that you would like to lift up in prayer. People on your hearts, people on your mind.
I got one.
Yes, sir.
A friend of mine, Scott Ritchie, he's in the hospital. He has a form of pancreatic cancer. He's not doing so well.
Scott Ritchie.
Scott Ritchie.
Scott Ritchie. Yes, ma'am.
Fred Stanley's son-in-law that was in the car accident and just the whole situation.
Fran Stanley's son-in-law that was in a car accident. He is now in Spokane in rehab. Yes, sir.
My daughter Susan, COVID.
Your daughter Susan with COVID. We have a friend that is a nurse, and one of her colleagues just committed suicide because of all the death and disease that they have been dealing with for the last 2 years. I did not give a name.
Oh, you didn't get a name.
I did not give a name. But remember that family. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Sam Wood.
Sam Wood.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. I asked prayers for a family in my former church. One of the pillars of the church passed away. Her name is Norma Gale. So remember that family. Let's pray for ourselves today, in as much as we are looking at a very difficult chapter. We're looking at the death of Christ. So, let's pray together. God, it seems that we have a lot of people on our hearts and our minds, and there are injuries and disease and tragedies among us. We give all of these to you, asking that you touch them with your love and your grace. Show us where we might be your hands and your feet. In Christ's name. Okay, last week we did not meet. I'm glad most of you did not come. For those of you who did, God bless you. Praise you. I'm sorry we weren't here to greet you.
I'm sorry too.
But anyway, today we are continuing with the trial of Christ. Last week we looked at the arrest of Christ and the Jewish portion of the trial. Something I did not point out that I want to point out today is in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus prayed, Father, let this cup pass from me, but nevertheless not what I will, but your will be done. That's where the real battle took place. It wasn't on the cross, it was in the garden. Because it was in the garden where Jesus got his answer. He said, Lord, what I want is for this cup to pass. Nevertheless, not what I want, but what you want. And it was in the garden that he found out what was necessary and what the price would be. So the cross is the effect of that, but it was the garden where the battle took place. We're looking today at the the Gentile portion of Jesus' trial. The Jewish portion of his trial was nothing more than a travesty and a tragedy, and they broke no fewer than 13 of their own laws in the trial. Today we look at the Gentile portion. The Gentile portion is heartless. It is brutal. Shows how cheap human life was during that period, but it was normal for a Roman trial. It was standard operating procedure. So we look at verse 1, chapter 15. Very early in the morning, the chief priests, the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin reached a decision. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Are you the king of the Jews? Pilate asked. Yes. It is as you say, Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of. But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. There's a lot in that little passage, so let me point out just a couple of things. Very early in the morning, this is right at daylight. Well, the last law that the Jews broke is no trial was supposed to take place during the dark. All trials needed to take place during the daylight hours so that people could come and participate. Jesus' trial was at night. Very early in the morning, at daybreak, is when the Roman government began to operate at daylight in the morning. They took him very early in the morning. The Sanhedrin reached a decision. Now, in the Jewish portion of the trial, what Jesus was accused of was blasphemy, claiming he was God's son or Messiah. In the Gentile portion of the trial, when they went to Pilate, they decided not to accuse Jesus of blasphemy because that would mean nothing to the Romans. So they accused him of treason, saying he was claimed to be king of the Jews. You know what Pilate asked him? Are you king of the Jews? And Jesus says, it is as you say. They made many other accusations against Jesus, but none of them they could make stick. But Jesus didn't answer any of the accusations. And it says here that Pilate was amazed that he didn't answer. Aren't you going to answer? Jesus says nothing. The reason Pilate is amazed is that if he doesn't answer the accusations, Pilate has a right to immediately condemn him. But if he answers them, then he can defend himself. But Jesus makes no attempt at defending himself. Verse 6. Now it was a custom at the feast to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Pilate asked, knowing it was out of envy that the chief priest had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. What shall I do then with the one you call king of the Jews? Pilate asked them. Crucify him, they shouted. Why? What crime has he committed? Pilate asked. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Now listen to this. Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. To pacify the Jews, who were unruly, to say the least. It was the custom of the Roman government in Jerusalem to release a prisoner at the Passover. Whatever prisoner they wanted. There was an insurrectionist, probably of the party called the Zealots, that was part of an uprising by the name of Barabbas. He was a murderer. Now, in the eyes of the Jewish people, some of them may have seen him as a hero. Zealots were a quote-unquote denomination, if you will, within the Jewish religion that was extreme and extremely radical. They kept a dagger up one sleeve or the other of their garment in case they got the opportunity to kill a Roman. That's how they lived their lives. They were extremists. Mark talks about the insurrection as if his readers would have known exactly what he was talking about, and they probably did. But that has escaped history. We have no idea what they are talking about, what happened in Jerusalem. But there was some type of insurrection. Barabbas was part of it. He was party to murder. And Pilate says, "Now who shall I release to you? Don't you want me to release?" Basically what he says, "Don't you want me to release the one called King of the Jews?" And the chief priest and the elders incited the crowd and convinced the crowd, small as it probably was, to ask for Barabbas instead of Jesus. "What shall I do with Jesus then?" "Crucify him," is what they shouted. From the other gospel accounts, we know that Pilate tried 3 separate times to convince them to allow him to release Jesus. He did not want to execute him. 3 different times he tried to do that. And they shouted all the more, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." And he says very clearly, "I find no fault with this man. Nevertheless, even though he found no fault with Jesus, he still had him crucified, just to pacify the Jews." Human life today is cheap, but not nearly as cheap as it was in that era. I'll give you an example of that. Most of us know the phrase, Nero fiddled while Rome burned, right?
Right.
And he accused the Christians of setting the fire. And in retaliation, quote unquote, though everybody knows the Christians didn't do that, he lined the streets from his palace all the way through the streets. I think it was about 1.5 miles. Both sides of the street with crosses, with Christians. He had them doused with tar and set on fire. And it was said he did that to light the way for his guests to come into one of his banquets. Human life was cheap. Verse 15, wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Flogging was done with something called a cat of nine tails. It's not a long whip. It's a whip that's about 4 feet long. It has 9 pieces of leather, and at the end of every piece of leather, there is a piece of bone or a piece of lead. It was designed every time it touched flesh to pull out a piece. Among the Jews, it was illegal to lash anyone more than 39 times. 40 was supposed to kill a person. But among the Romans, there were no laws, no such laws. And it was very often that people did not survive a flogging. Jesus was beat very severely. I'll get to that in just a moment. Observations on this, something you would like to ask or add? Verse 16. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is, the Praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him and twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. They began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff, spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe, put on his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. The Praetorium is a place where, I guess for you military folks, it is the barracks. This is the place that housed a company of soldiers. The soldiers that were in charge of crucifying Jesus, there were 4 of them. They took him to the barracks for the sole purpose of making fun of him, mocking him, and making a spectacle out of him. They took his robe off. They put on an old garment that was purple in color, which is the sign, it was the color of royalty. They plaited a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and then they took a staff and began to beat the crown of thorns down on his head. We know from other accounts that they also hit him with their fist. They struck him. They beat him very severely. When they said, "Hail, King of the Jews," that was obviously a mockery. It is kind of a bastardization of "Hail Caesar." They would bow their knee and make fun of him. Then they led him out to be crucified. Let's just move on right to the crucifixion. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country. They forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. They crucified him, and they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was the third hour when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Christ, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. There's a lot of imagery in modern artistic depictions of the crucifixion that are inaccurate. We see in modern depictions Jesus carrying the entire cross. We know that to be very inaccurate. The vertical piece at the place where crucifixions took place were already in place. They did that to remind people who passed by, this could be yours. The Romans did it very intentionally. They left them up in place all the time. When a person was to be crucified, always male, it was seen to be too brutal to execute a woman that way. They tied the cross beam to the person's arms. And that's how they carried it. It was tied to their arms and they carried it. Jesus was beaten so severely by the Jews and then by the Romans. He was so severely weakened by the flogging, he was unable to carry the crossbeam. So Simon of Cyrene was compelled to carry it. Again, Mark assumes his readers would know who this is. Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Must have been prominent people within the circle of people called Christian. I want to give you a brief description of the crucifixion. Not the whole thing, but a brief description. We are conditioned again by modern art and our songs. Remember the old rugged cross? 504 in the Methodist hymnal. I'll tell you one day how I know that. But on a hill far away. Now, far from us, yes. But it wasn't on a hill far away from those people. Crucifixion was a brutal, in-your-face kind of death. When they got to the place of crucifixion, the person being crucified was thrown to the ground. They were stripped of all of their clothing, not some of their clothing, all of their clothing. Remember, their arms are already tied to the crossbeam. As a result, it was relatively easy for the Romans to drive spikes through their arms. We have it in the palm. That is incorrect. We know from crucified victims that have been unearthed that the nail went through the wrist. It did not go through the palm. The palm will not support the body. It went through the wrist. There is a gap in between your two bones there where the nail went. Remember that the Romans are experts at this. Once they were nailed to the cross, they were simply walked over to the vertical beam. The cross beam was tied to the vertical beam, and they were just standing there on the ground. We are all taught that there were 3 nails. There are 4. One heel was lifted up at a time, and they were nailed to the outside of the vertical beam. One leg was nailed on, and then the other leg was nailed on. People who were crucified died of a combination of things: exposure, blood loss, but mostly asphyxiation. The nerves that run down the arm go into the spine at basically the same place as the muscles, the nerves that control the muscles for the diaphragm. When someone is hanging on the cross, they are in a position of inhaling. And they have to, in order to exhale, they have to raise themselves on the nails in their feet. So every time they took a breath, they had to raise themselves on the nails in their feet. And that would have been repeated again and again and again for as long as the person lived. That is what happened in the crucifixion. So, instead of being on a hill far away, it would have been right here. You could walk up and look at a person face to face. When it says they spit on him, they could walk up and spit right in his face. This was meant to be in your face, personal. Not something distant, not something removed. Jesus was crucified at 9 in the morning. Verse 33. At the 6th hour, 9 to 12, at the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. The 9th hour, 3 o'clock. Jesus was on the cross from 9 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. At the 6th hour, darkness came across the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Then some of those standing near heard this. They said, listen, he's calling Elijah. One man ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah will come and take him down, he said. With a loud voice, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come with him to Jerusalem were also there. Several things. Jesus was crucified at 9 in the morning. At 12 noon, darkness fell over the whole land. We know from other accounts there was also earthquakes. At 3 o'clock, Jesus utters this phrase, my God, why have you forsaken me? A number of years ago, I heard a lecture that was mind-blowing to me. Those words are the first words of a song. My God, why have you forsaken me? Are the first words of a song. Psalm 22. It is not a psalm of defeat, despite how it begins. It is a psalm of victory. The battle took place in the garden. This is a victory psalm. On the cross, Jesus is reciting a song, because this is victory for him. Despite how it looks to the world, Jesus is paying the ultimate price and accomplishing exactly what God wants him to do. The man who fills the sponge with the vinegar wants to find out if Elijah is going to come. There was among the Jewish people, there was a theory that during times of utter darkness, Elijah would come and help. Let's see if he'll do that. Jesus died with a loud cry, not with a whimper. Not the typical death of someone dying on a cross. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. I'd always asked and wondered why from top to bottom is important. It is. First of all, let me tell you what the curtain is. The curtain is in the temple, separates the holy place, the place of the priest, with the most holy place, the holiest of holies, where the high priest would end once a year. This is a wool curtain. And for those of you who do any type of crocheting, any type of weaving, this curtain is 3.5 inches thick. It is massive. It is extremely heavy. You can unravel it from bottom to top, but you cannot from top to bottom. The curtain was torn in two between the holy place and the most holy place to symbolize Christ's death opens access to the very presence of God for everyone. Not for some, not just for the Jewish people, but for all people. This is extremely significant. This is a declaration that this action, horrific as it may be, has opened access to God, emphasizing that all have access. The centurion who was standing guard, one of the four soldiers charged with the crucifixion, when he saw how Jesus died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. You'll note there that there were many women who had followed Jesus from Galilee that were there. You remember what happened to the disciples at the garden? They fled. Who was at the cross? The women. Now we know John was also there. We'll see that in one of the other Gospels when we get to that book. But most of the disciples were gone, but the women were not there. Were not gone. They were still there. So what I really want you to hear in this is this is very intimate. This is not remote. This is, and it was done in a very public place. It was done on a thoroughfare. Golgotha, place of the skull, might refer to a small hill on a major thoroughfare just outside of Jerusalem that looks like a skull from certain angles. But it probably was reference to the number of people who were crucified there. Because most often, people who were crucified were not taken down. They were allowed to die and rot. Which brings us to this last section. It was a day of preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Now listen carefully to how Pilate responds. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. Day of preparation is Friday, day before the Sabbath. Why is it called the day of preparation? Preparing for the Sabbath. Now, general preparation for the Sabbath was to prepare all meals that would be consumed on the Sabbath. You don't cook or prepare a meal on the Sabbath day. You prepare that on the day of preparation, which is Friday. Joseph of Arimathea was a prominent member of the council. What council is that? That's the Sanhedrin. He apparently was not there when Jesus was condemned. He himself believed in Jesus. He asked for the body of Jesus so that he might bury it. He went to Pilate. Pilate was surprised that Jesus was already dead. Often, people lasted for 2 or 3 days on a cross before they died. Jesus died presumably because of the weight of the world was on his shoulders, but also because of the very severe beating he took before the crucifixion. We know that from the other Gospels, the Jews were concerned about since it was a special Passover, since it was a special Sabbath, which was during the Passover, they did not want the bodies to be left on the cross. So they requested that they be taken down from one of the other Gospels. When they go to, what they do to take down the bodies is they go and they break the legs of the people who were crucified. Why? If they break the legs, they cannot breathe. They break the legs, and 5 minutes later, they can take them down. They get there, they break the legs of the two criminals, but they find that Jesus is already dead. In the other gospel accounts, they put a spear in his side, and out comes water and blood. That's a sign, by the way, of a massive heart attack. Some would say a broken heart. So Pilate is surprised. Jesus is already dead. He was on the cross for roughly 6 hours. Joseph wraps him in the cloth, placed his body in a tomb that had never been used. I often get questions about that. What do you mean, a tomb that had never been used? Well, how many of you have ever been in New Orleans? Some of you have. You ever seen the mausoleums there? They have a family mausoleum, and they have stacks of caskets. They have one that's out prominent. When Aunt Susie dies, you put her in there. When Uncle Frank dies, you move Aunt Susie over here, and you put Uncle Frank over here. And just keep on. Well, in that era, they did a little bit differently. Of course, they didn't have the proper embalming stuff, yada, yada, yada. And so when a body would decay, somebody else needed to be put in there. They would take the bones of Aunt Susie, put them in a small box, a really rather small box, and stack them over in the corner. And you just keep on doing that until this was. And you had two rooms. You had a room where the body was prepared, and then another shelf where the body was laid. And then next to it was the storage area. But we know that Joseph had just purchased or had this commissioned, and no one had ever been laid in this particular tomb. Joseph requested the body of Jesus, prepared it as best he could, and put it in his own tomb. Anything about this story that surprises you? Anything you would like to ask or add? I think I saw it. Yes, sir.
I'm a little confused by not having any elevation or the other up on the
Right.
post, because the guy often can sponge on a reed, like he had to go up a little bit for that. Jesus also says, when I'm lifted up, so you get the impression a little bit of up.
Yeah. He is lifted off the ground, about 6 inches. Just enough to bend his knees. And when somebody is crucified, there's a lot of excrement and blood. You don't want to get close. That's reason to read. You don't want to get close. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Well, in this version, there are two prisoners along with him, and one of them, Jesus said, you will be with me.
You will be with the question is, the observation is, in the other gospel accounts, one of the criminals that's crucified with him the thief says, when you get to your kingdom, remember me. And Jesus says, today you'll be with me in paradise. Mark does not record that. Remember, Mark is the dragnet gospel. They began by hurling insults at him. The thief in the other gospel has a change of heart and says, when you get to your kingdom, remember me. So let me talk about the stone, because this will be important next week. In front of the tomb, there is a shallow ditch that is literally, quite literally, it is a hole carved in the rock, solid rock. In front of the tomb, in front of the hole, there's a shallow trench that is shaped like this, like a bowl. They would take a round rock and roll it into that ditch, and it would just settle into place. And then it would be hard to remove it from there. Somebody that just couldn't just come along and move it. Very substantial, several hundred pounds. And we'll hear in some of the Gospels where the ladies who are going to the tomb are wondering how in the world they're going to move the stone. That's why. It's in this ditch, and it is very substantial. Yes, ma'am.
Was Mary Jesus' mother there during the crucifixion?
Yes, ma'am, she was. Yes, she was. Others. When Adam Hamilton tells the story of the crucifixion, he talks about Mary would have been able to walk up and lay her head on his chest. I mean, it's that personal. Okay. I always hate to end chapter 15. I want to get him out of the tomb. I'd like to do chapter 15 and 16 together, but we'll do chapter 16 next week. And after we do chapter 16 next week, we'll have some funnies then, but not today. No. Not today. So as you go into your world, I know today is a hard lesson, but we need to hear it. We need to be reminded of it. One of the services that I love and hate is Good Friday service. But it is so very necessary for us to get the impact of Easter. So I want to send you forth with what I will use probably this Good Friday. It may be Friday, but Sunday's coming. Remember that. In Christ's name.